Some of you will remember me. I used to be a local government bureaucrat in full mode. Grants and corporate grant management were a ticket. But I was also scratching away at the first versions of the compact in the early days. And some of the problems and issues that were there then, I would still challenge tonight, and I will do in a few of my comments. On a low-grade point, it was nice to be asked out of the care home to come and speak again, if you tolerate that. And it's a measure of what a good venue this is. In that between the bus stop and here, I was able to go into Poundland and buy a pair of specs because I'd lost mine somewhere in the course of the day, being an old codger. What do I think about this investment and resourcing section? It's okay as far as it goes. There's some new ideas in there, and there's a flavour of strong leadership around some of the reshaping of the compact tracts here. I do like to see the notion that there's really strong political leadership, and with Maureen Child here and others flag carrying for the compact at every level of the partner agencies. That's great, and I know that's more general than just talking about resourcing. The asset transfer idea, I just put in something which might light this up a wee bit. In the old days, in a council not so far from here, somebody decided that it would be best that a small community group should run their community centre. The council had previously managed the whole thing, and what happened was that the community group were given the control of the building, but the council hung on to things like energy management, roof repairs and stuff, because it had a preset professional view of what an organisation was capable of. And all sorts of outrageous things happened, and it culminated in a deputation by this group to the full council. And I remember the local member championing the cause of this beleaguered group. He said, "Lord Provost, this little community centre uses a kettle and a fridge. What they're complaining about today is the fact that their monthly electricity bills are over £2,000. You'd think they were smelting aluminium on Wednesday afternoons with these bills they're getting from the council." Now, the council had just ballsed it up, but the notion of giving full asset transfer and full ownership and control seems to be really important in that silly example. What about the dilemmas here? One of the ones that I was always struggling with, I've talked to Harriet and Ella and others about it over the years. There's a choice as you present a strategy that's about a comprehensive view of how Edinburgh should function. You're left with going for the high level description of cooperative activity, of principles, of strategic intent, and leaving behind the points that were being raised here earlier about what does it really mean at the grassroots level, and does it mean anything to people? And I remember I was once invited to a dinner, and I took compact leaflets with me, and I dished them round the table. It was a dinner of a voluntary organisation. And people came up to me at the end and said, "What the hell is this? I just don't get it." And I think that's a choice still. Would you stay with that high-level, sophisticated presentation of it? Edinburgh is a sophisticated place, after all. Or would you go for an entirely different approach to resourcing and investing in something on a partnership basis? So I'll put this in because I think it's a half idea. Supposing the partners with strong leaders at the top end, civic leadership frame around it, said, "We're going to tackle one of the city's wicked issues by committing resources in an entirely different way and an entirely different approach. We'll put offices together, we'll put people together from our different partner agencies, we'll create a secretariat or an executive to sort problem X or Y." Now, would that be a different approach? Would it be a front-end demonstration of a partnership delivery that's really working? Now, you might be reacting and saying, and it might come up in questions, well, Total Place is kind of doing that. But no, I don't think it is. It's not about flag carrying for the solving of a whole city issue. So you could be a lot more ambitious in this resourcing and investment approach and say, let's take much more creative ideas about how you put resources together, financial, people, infrastructure, and make something really work. Now, people would have to sacrifice their individuality as organisations, but there would be the sense of a common track that was gassed up a great deal more than perhaps some of our activities are at the moment. Limits and problems. Jeff and I and others discussed this a wee bit before we came tonight, about a week ago. We talked about the change in public sector ethics, if you like. No, that's not quite the right phrase. The public service ethic. You know, as I left the council a few years ago, most of the folk that worked in it, and a lot of the folk in the other agencies too, had come from the stable of spending and developing their career in the public service. But now, local government, in my judgment, is largely run by people that take a business approach. And so you have the dominance of a business approach and the dominance of the market ethic in all of what's going on. Is that the right thing? I just read in my management mag today a summary of the latest book by Charles Handy, the management guru. Can't remember the title of it. It's something like The Second Curve or something. It's a new presentation of management approaches to providing goods and services. And what he says is, and he was a market man from the start, he says that the market is imperfect. It needs a much more and challenged intervention to make it remotely respectable. And that's someone who seems to have had a conversion along the way. So there's that dimension. Then what about professionalism and departmentalism? I mentioned it in relation to, you know, the estates service providing electricity bills that were completely wrong, or charging people by coding things wrong, or doing stuff wrong. But you know that people hang in for what they've always believed to be the best way of doing things on their terms. So there's a challenge in there as well. And a lot of the people that worked on the first draft in the compact were folk who had a wider view and weren't quite so hidebound by that. So it's a big people thing. How do you get people to develop a mature partnership discussion and sustain it outside of their professional envelopes? It's really quite difficult. And if anything, the first run of the compact has taken many steps in that regard with a great many people. But of course, it's different in agencies now, isn't it? People aren't in the same berth for a good number of years. People come and go. Different imperatives arrive overnight sometimes. Next limit and problem, the difficulty of measuring social value and impact. I remember spending ages on this in my final year or two at the council. 2 or 3 of us working on different approaches to it. We had looked at all sorts of other lines in it with Milland and the others in the compact. I don't think it's sorted yet. There isn't a product that says, yes, we can successfully measure the impact of what's going on in something sophisticated like a citywide partnership. So there's a challenge. It would be part and parcel of my different approach that I was suggesting earlier to say, let's solve a wicked issue. You could at least box that up and get some indicators shot down to try and solve that. So that would be, you know, a different approach again. Here's another one. Beware the neighbourhood approach. Folk won't like this. I used to go out on the stump along with elected members and others, officers from all the departments, going around the neighbourhood partnerships. I enjoyed it greatly. It educated you mightily. But is it not the case that placemaking issues, the dog poo, the bins, the whole lot, they're easily sorted at neighbourhood level, and there are some differentials around the city in terms of what sort of service pattern should be delivered into particular areas. But if it's a people service, if it's a personal service in the areas of poverty and inequality that are the heart of some of these strategic intentions, is it really a neighbourhood dimension that's important? Or is it about the sophisticated and rapid response of the agencies to individual needs? And I question putting all the eggs in the neighbourhood basket. Finally, on the resource end of things, it's a broader point again, and I've spun rather wide, I know. What about trust? The pattern of partnership work sometimes, and not predominantly in Edinburgh, but around the country, but you'll hear it still here. You know, the consultation is about the resource holding agencies telling people what's going to happen. It's not a full engagement. People don't trust each other enough, and the atmosphere of trust is easily damaged. Now we've had 10 years of the compact, and trust has been built up a great deal. But what about a different approach to that, to building that trust? And I was struggling away trying to think of something to suggest here. I'm suggesting that more teeth are needed in this area. Supposing you went for, again, you would need some people and maybe some money put to it. What about some kind of standing conference on resourcing services in the city and sustaining a discussion that was very prominent and very public and made an impact in the wider community around the questions and dilemmas that exist there? Keep it in the public eye, keep high-level research and analysis of inputs and products, keep that in the front of the civic life of the city. Would that make some kind of difference? It would need an extraordinary step beyond what we currently do. I think that was the key headers that I wanted to put up, except to reiterate Jeff's point about leadership. I think I touched on it in 2 or 3 strands through what I said, but it needs a leadership tone in the city that's at the political level, at the main agency level, but it means that there should be more dialogue between the leaders around the compact themes. And while lots of us, I remember this very, very clearly, worked away at our sort of middle management level maybe, certainly in the city council, health, police, we didn't easily carry it up to the very top and get our leaders to really get a hold of it and own it. And I think that's still a major challenge. Thanks very much.
I'm always struck by the fact that there's this kind of myth about people who are hard to reach, and to be perfectly honest with you, those very same people are not hard to reach. They're either battering our doors down, or we're actually living beside them and we're working beside them. So, and I think one of the things we do as we take this language and the stuff to that strategic level is we forget some of that stuff, and we forget it's not just about the financial inward investment, but it's actually about where we are and how we work with people. That's a resource that we should never underestimate, that we bring to the table, whatever strategic discussions we're having. And for me, there's a kind of, I think David said, leadership at all the different levels. And there is something about, we kind of need to be able to feed stuff up so we can decide whoever holds a pound, and yeah, I'd be very happy for us as a sector to hold a pound. But we need to kind of have some sort of cohesive decision or feel about what it is we want our city to look like. So you need those strategic discussions, and we need to kind of de-jargonise it so we can all participate in that. But we also need to have that feeling of place. There's been an incredible piece of work done recently about mapping natural communities where people feel they belong, not where administrative structures are, not where council wards are, not where we decide we are going to deliver services, but actually where people feel they belong. And I've been around long enough to think, to remember kind of good old community development work, and it was based on where people felt they belong. And I think there's something about creating some more sophistication around that stuff that I think would then stop those barriers at the different levels that we're saying, you know, oh, this is strategic citywide, nothing to do with me, or I don't quite understand it, but somehow or the other I'm going to have to pinch some of that language to put it into a grant application just so I can tick some boxes and people say, you get through the first hurdle. So there's a big piece of work there about communication. There's a big piece of work about demystifying some of that. But there's also just a big piece of work about advocating for people and citizens, which is what you were saying at the very beginning.
Just a few points to try and pick up on what people have been saying. I guess the focus on to the private sector at the moment is on how are they adding social value, and I'm wondering in the public sector if we are being explicit enough about how we're adding social value, so not just in the direct delivery of services, but everything that we're doing around that. I think a greater focus on grassroots up and having conversations with people is really, really important, and not to negate the amount of time that takes to build relationships. They don't just happen overnight, and we're involved in a number of things at the moment which are probably taking quite a long, long time and are probably quite frustrating for a lot of people, but it's important that you do the relationship building at the beginning, because that's going to engineer the trust. It's going to be able to make some of the harder decisions easier to take in a way. Also, I think it's not just any kind of leadership, but it's a leadership that's rooted in shared values, because you can have leadership, but it might not necessarily be bad. It might be very charismatic leadership, which might not be what's actually needed. And I think, lastly, sometimes I think we just make things too complicated. And there's maybe something about some of the stuff that's come out today is it feels quite simple, it feels quite intuitive, and maybe we should just go with that more gut feeling than try and make something too constructed.
Perfect link, because I'm just going to give some really simplistic responses to some of the things that were said. I've heard a lot recently about the different sectors. At our most recent compact meeting, Glenda rightly had raised the issue of third sector by numerically suggest that it's less important than others. I've heard it today at the Scottish Community Safety Convention as well. For me, I've just started thinking about this being the one sector that's got all those layers below it, but it's an Edinburgh sector and we're all a part of that. The investment, picking up on the speaker from earlier, absolutely comes from strong leadership, and that includes police, fire and rescue and everyone else to commit the resource into the areas where it's relevant to them. I like the New Orleans example as well, and I genuinely think that with the community empowerment bill that's coming along, that's all about citizen focus and empowerment. It wouldn't be out with the realms of possibility for that to happen here as well. And finally, I think it's very easy, particularly my own organisation, to talk about the restrictions that we face with cutting budgets, and we're seeing that across all that one sector. But when you actually look at the pool of money that's still available for Edinburgh, if we're doing this collaborative approach, it's still a significant amount of money if it's spent wisely and with the leadership where it needs to be. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, just pick up on David's point, I suppose, Jeff's point and comments from the audience about the need to be more aspirational in the strategy, particularly in this theme, and a lot of what David said around the asset transfer certainly resonated. This notion of full transfer and not dumping an asset on a group as a way to cut costs. So there's something in that, but to assure people, certainly the council's looking at that through either cooperative capital or the new community empowerment bill coming. You know, we're going to have a legislative provision here that forces us to be more systematic in the way either we assess those applications or we refuse and accept those applications. And just to share with colleagues in the room, some very productive discussions linked to this with CLD colleagues in the council, community learning development colleagues on community centres and which ones could we go for a fuller asset transfer. So I think that's quite an exciting bit that needs to figure in this strand a bit more. Again, picking up on terms of the co-production bit, the tendering arguments, the business ethics, there's something in there about this strategy needing to articulate a need for this not just to be about grants and contracts. So we have to fundamentally rethink about who delivers what service. And I really like this point that's come through in the compact partnership discussions about the third sector being the first port of call for a discussion about who could deliver or who could innovate. rather than the public sector being that or the private sector being that. Third sector levers in, I think Graham did a state of the third sector report, £2.3 billion to the Edinburgh economy. That's 2.3 times the size of the council's contribution. So that was a wake-up call for some of our members about the importance of the economic leverage and the jobs in the city. And on top of that, you lay the social value and the services. And the whole thing starts to hang together much more as, you know, we're not talking about equal respect here. We're talking about, we go to third sector as a default position to look how we get the service solutions. That needs to be writ large. The last point I would pick up on, so I know we're short for time, but I've heard this localities bit. There is a strong critique of place-based policy making, and not least from a community of interest perspective, that communities may define themselves across geographical boundaries that we artificially impose. But I would share with you the one lesson from the Total Place pilots was this notion of families in common. Families that have persistent intergenerational inequality, poverty, disadvantage, lack of aspiration. And these families aren't strange to us. They are known to all of us, especially if you go to local councillors who can tell you who the families are. And no matter what we spend on these families in terms of our interventions, either third sector or public, there is no improvement in those outcomes. And there is something about the better integration of services locally with the third sector at the heart of that, because the third sector, probably with the exception of the fire service, are the only ones that can get across the door into these families. They're the only ones that are trusted. We have terrible difficulties. The police have terrible difficulties. Health service have difficulties because we're on a formal referral. So there's something in the locality model which I think provides the sector, but the city and these families with an opportunity to get better services, because you just add to the chaos. And incidentally, these families cost us hundreds of thousands of pounds a year. And that's a kind of byproduct of this. So I suppose coming back to my first point, and sorry to weave around a number of different issues, this is critical to the sector, the critical outcome, I think. And it needs to articulate an aspiration for the next 10 years that sees the sector not just having this debate about grants and contracts. You're getting assets. You're the first point of delivery for innovation. You're the first point of delivery for public service. That needs to be articulated, I think, predominantly in this theme.
Thanks very much indeed. And so we'll move to our final section now.
And I'm going to do this very briefly indeed, because you've all been sitting there for a very, very long time. So as part